In this video, we're going to talk about the AWS Certified Developer Associate. Go over the exam guide so you know what's expected of you so you can start preparation. Let's go ahead and get started. So the AWS Certified Developer Associate certification is a credential that's going to help identify and develop talent with critical skills for implementing cloud initiatives. Earning the AWS Certified Developer Associate will validate your ability to write and deploy cloud-based applications. So, who should take this exam? This exam is intended for anyone with 1 or more years of hands-on experience developing and maintaining an AWS-based application or set of applications. Before you take this exam, we recommend you have. Now, before I jump into that list, if you are not an actual developer and you're not a coder, this certification is definitely worthwhile. Let's say, for example, you want to be an AWS Solution Architect Associate. You're going to be speaking to development teams all the time. So it's good that you know the types of services that the development teams will need to use so they can build well-architected solutions on AWS. So ideally, it's good to have an in-depth knowledge of at least one high-level programming language, an understanding of core AWS services, the use of those services, and basic AWS architecture best practices, proficiency in developing, deploying, and debugging cloud-based applications using the AWS writing code for serverless applications, ability to identify key features of AWS services and use the AWS Service APIs, CLI, and SDKs to write those applications. You also need to be able to apply a basic understanding of cloud-native applications to write code and the ability to author, maintain, and debug modules on AWS. Just a couple of other things I wanted to mention. This exam is an associate level. It's 130 minutes to complete the exam. That's how much time you're giving. It's $150 US. And there's 65 multiple choice / multiple response questions on this exam. Now, let's go ahead and jump right into the exam guide. Before you take any AWS certification, the exam guide is like the first place to start because you need to figure out, okay, how's this thing laid out and what's going to be expected of you. So we already went through the introduction in terms of who this exam is intended for. You need to demonstrate an understanding of the core AWS services I mentioned and the proficiency in the deploying, debugging the cloud-based applications. That's all well understood at this point. Now, the target candidate. You need some general IT knowledge. So if you don't have any general IT knowledge, this might not be the best certification to start off with. Also, if you have no other AWS certifications, you might want to rethink which one you should start off with. Perhaps you want to go for AWS Cloud Practitioner first. I do have a video on that. You're more than welcome to take a look at. Highly encourage it. But yeah, general IT knowledge and high-level programming language, application lifecycle management, the ability to write code for serverless applications. Writing code for serverless applications is very desirable in 2022. A lot of trends are towards building modern applications, and serverless is one of those trends. So I'm glad to see that here. And understand the use of containers in the development process. That's the general IT knowledge. Now, for the recommended AWS knowledge, we need to have some familiarity with the AWS APIs, command line, SDKs, as was mentioned earlier. The shared responsibility model, that's a common thing. What you're responsible for as a developer or solution architect on AWS and what AWS is responsible for. It's good to know about continuous integration and continuous delivery, CI/CD pipelines, to deploy applications on AWS. Using and interacting with AWS services. Like I say, if you've done any amount of using AWS or you have an AWS account, built anything on AWS, this would give you some good interaction. Apply basic understanding of cloud native applications to write code. And write code by using AWS security best practices. For example, using IAM roles instead of secrets and access keys in the code. Don't want to do that. It's much better to go with the IAM role. And knowledge about authoring, maintaining, and debugging code modules on AWS. What is considered out of scope for the target candidate? Okay, these are things you do not need to know how to do, and that would be designing an architecture for a distributed system and microservices outside of the scope of this exam. In real life, you'll have to do that, but luckily for this exam, you don't have to go deep there. And designing and implementing a CI/CD pipeline. I'm going to let you pass on this one. You don't need to do that, but it will be something you'll need to do in reality and maybe even for future employment, but not for this exam. You don't need to administer IAM users or groups. You don't need to administer Amazon Elastic Container Service. You don't need to talk much about or know much about AWS networking infrastructure, for example, Amazon VPC or AWS Direct Connect. And you don't need to understand compliance or licensing. That's all outside of scope. Okay, for the exam content, there's two types of response, either multiple choice, which would be one correct answer out of a total of 4 answers, which means there's a total of 3 distractors. Or another type of question could be a multiple response. So this will be a question that has 2 or more correct answers out of a total of 5 or more response options. All right, and there are 15 unscored questions on there. You can get those wrong, and there will be no points, or this will not count against you on the test. The trick is you're not going to know which ones those are, so you don't get to select which ones you want to get wrong. So get them all right. All right. The exam results, this is pass or fail, like most things in life. The scale for the score ranges from 100 to 1,000. I'm expecting you to get a 1,000 on this. Well, let me know in the comments if you're planning on getting a perfect score. All right, drop that in the comments. I want to know your name. I want to know your name, and say I'm going to get 1,000 on this. And then the minimum passing score is a 720. This is the bare minimum that you can get and still pass it. Drop me a comment and let me know if you're planning on getting a 720, just getting over the hump and passing it. Okay, let's go to the content outline. Now, this is very important. These are the domains that these are the domains that you will be tested from. There's 5 of them. So there's domain 1, deployment, that's 22%. Domain 2 is security, representing 26%. That's a quarter of the exam. Development with AWS Services, 30%, almost 1/3 of the entire exam. Domain 4, refactoring, 10%. And domain 5, monitoring and troubleshooting, 12%. For a total of, you guessed it, 100. See, I'm good at math. All right, hang in there with me now. Let's go over this stuff because this is all stuff you need to know. So I'm going through it right now to save you the headache of having to read this document. You have me here to shepherd you along through this. So, domain 1, deployment, bullet point 1.1. You need to be able to deploy written code in AWS using existing CI/CD pipelines, processes, and patterns. So that includes having knowledge of committing code to a repository and invoking build, test, and or deployment actions. Now, this is the knowledge of things you need to know how to do. So when you get questions, you're going to get scenarios, right, that are asking you to do something, and then the responses will test that knowledge that are listed here in the bullet points throughout all the domains. You need to use labels and branches for versions and release management. You need to have knowledge of AWS Code Pipeline to orchestrate workflows against different environments. You need to be able to apply AWS Code Commit, AWS Code Build, AWS Code Pipeline, AWS Code Star, and AWS Code Deploy for CI/CD purposes. These are a lot of the DevOps services within AWS. You need to have knowledge of performing a rollback plan based on application deployment policies. Bullet point 1.2, deploying applications using AWS Elastic Beanstalk. Utilizing existing supported environments to define a new application stack, packaging an application with Elastic Beanstalk, introducing a new application version into the Elastic Beanstalk environment, utilizing a deployment policy to deploy an application version. For example, all at once, rolling with batch or an immutable deployment, validating application health using the Elastic Beanstalk dashboard, and having knowledge of Amazon CloudWatch logs to instrument application logging. And logging is good for observability here. Bullet point 1.3, prepare the application deployment package to be deployed in AWS. So you'll need to be able to have knowledge of managing the dependencies of the code modules, like the environment variables, config files, and static image files within the package. Outline the package, container, directory structure, and organize files appropriately, and translate resource requirements to AWS infrastructure parameters. For example, memory cores. Bullet point 1.4, deploy serverless applications, including, given a use case, be able to implement and launch an AWS serverless application model, also known as AWS SAM template. AWS SAM was a very straightforward way to deploy serverless applications. Manage environments in individual AWS services. In other words, being able to differentiate between deployment, test, and production in Amazon API Gateway. Now, let's go to domain 2, security. Security is always job number 1. No matter what I talk about here, remember security, domain 2, security is always job number 1. Because without security, guess what? You don't have an application or a service because it falls completely apart. Bullet point 2.1, make authenticated calls to AWS services. Communicate the required policy based on least privileges required by the application. Be able to assume an IAM role to access a service. Use the SDK's credential provider on premises or in the cloud to access AWS services, which would be the local credentials versus instance roles. Bullet point 2.2, implement encryption using AWS services. Encryption is super important. That's encryption data at rest via client side, server side, and envelope encryption using the AWS services themselves, and know how to encrypt data in transit. Bullet point 2.3, implement application and authentication and authorization. So that would be add user sign up and sign in functionality for applications with Amazon Cognito identity or user pools. Use Amazon Cognito to provide credentials to write code that access AWS services. Use Amazon Cognito to synchronize user profiles and data, and use developer authenticated identities to interact between end user devices, backend authentication, and Amazon Cognito. Amazon Cognito is a great service that allows for user signups and authentication into your applications, used by a lot of folks there. Great service. Okay, domain 3, development with AWS services. Bullet point 3.1, write code for serverless applications. That's a lot of stuff you need to know on this. Compare and contrast server-based versus serverless model. For example, microservices, stateless nature of serverless applications, scaling serverless applications, and decoupling layers of serverless applications. Configure AWS Lambda functions by defining environment variables and parameters. For example, the memory, the timeout, the runtime, the handler. Create an API endpoint using Amazon API Gateway. Create and test appropriate API actions like GET and POST using the API endpoint. Apply Amazon DynamoDB concepts, for example, establishing tables, adding items and attributes. knowing about compute read and write capacity units from Amazon DynamoDB based on application requirements. Associate an AWS Lambda function with an AWS event source, like Amazon API Gateway, for example, Amazon CloudWatch events, or Amazon S3 events, or Amazon Kinesis. This is being able to trigger those AWS Lambda functions with those AWS event sources that I just mentioned as an example. Being able to invoke an AWS Lambda function both synchronously and asynchronously. Bullet point 3.2 is translate functional requirements into application design. That's determining the real-time versus batch processing for a given use case, determine the use of synchronous versus asynchronous for a given use case, determine the use of event versus scheduled or poll for a given use case. In other words, do you want to trigger your processing either based on an event triggering something, or just let's schedule a poll something every so many minutes or hours or days? And then know about account for trade-offs for consistency models in an application design. Bullet point 3.3, implement application design into application code. So knowing how to write code to utilize messaging services, for example, in SQS, Simple Query Service, or SNS, Simple Notification Service. Using Amazon Elasticache to create a database cache. Using Amazon DynamoDB to index objects in Amazon S3. Writing a stateless AWS Lambda function. Like I say, there's a lot of work ahead here. A lot of things you got to know. But I have faith in you. I know you can do it. And that's why I'm taking the time to go over this exam guide in detail. Okay, so write a stateless AWS Lambda function. Write a web application with stateless web servers. In other words, it's a stateless application where the state is maintained outside of that web fleet of servers. Bullet point 3.4, write code that interacts with AWS services by using APIs, SDKs, and AWS CLIs. So that would be choosing the appropriate APIs, software development kits, and command line commands for the code components. Writing resilient code that deals with failures or exceptions. For example, retries with exponential backoff and jitter. Domain 4. Okay, the last couple of domains here, and we're at the final stretch of this exam guide. I hope you're taking notes, because there will be a test at the end of this. No, I'm just kidding. Domain 4, refactoring. Bullet point 4.1. Optimize applications to best use AWS services and features. That includes implementing AWS caching services to optimize the performance. For example, as I mentioned earlier, Amazon Elasticache and Amazon API Gateway Cache. Apply an Amazon S3 naming scheme for optimal read performance. Bullet point 4.2. Migrate existing application code to run on AWS. So that would be, how do you isolate the dependencies? Running the application as one or more stateless processes. Develop in order to enable horizontal scalability. So how do you refactor an application that only was designed to scale vertically and convert it over to being able to scale horizontally? And also decoupling the state of the application from the application itself and externalizing the state. And the final domain, domain 5, monitoring and troubleshooting. Bullet point 5.1, write code that can be monitored, which includes creating custom Amazon CloudWatch metrics, perform logging in a manner available to system operators, instrument application source code to enable tracing and AWS X-Ray. That's a great tool to debug applications, especially microservices, including also Lambda functions as well, to figure out, what is going on and how to optimize your application performance. Bullet point 5.2, perform root cause analysis on faults found in testing or production, which includes interpreting the outputs from the logging mechanism in AWS to identify errors in the logs, check build and test history in AWS services, for example, AWS Code Build, AWS Code Deploy, AWS Code Pipeline to identify issues, and utilizing AWS Services, Amazon CloudWatch, VPC Flow Logs, and AWS X-Ray to locate specific fault components. In other words, figure out what's going wrong there. All right. So I am not going to go over the appendix. The appendix is key tools and technology and concepts that might be covered on the exam. I'll let you look through this. I'm going to link to this particular document in the description down below. But I want to thank you for your time and attention. And I want to let you know, if you're new to the channel, here on Thoughtful Techie Cloud, I teach you AWS, cloud best practices, well-architected tips, and all kinds of great things related to AWS that you need to know to support you on your cloud journey. I'd ask that you go ahead and subscribe right now if you haven't already, because I have a ton of great videos on the channel and more to come in the future. So thank you, and I'll see you around in the next video.